Zephyr's tornadoes are without a doubt the most broken ability Warframe has ever seen. While working on my Zephyr in-depth guide and this video, I've had many moments where I almost descended into complete madness trying to comprehend what's going on with this actual bowl of spaghetti code that Digital Extremes have made. But I've mostly figured it out, and today I will try to explain and illustrate how and why Zephyr's tornadoes are Warframe's most busted ability, reaching unfathomable damage numbers that are in some cases able to scale infinitely and will most likely crash your game if you are playing on your dad's old 2015 Lenovo ThinkPad. Let's get into it. Tornadoes are the fourth ability of the wind-themed Warframe Zephyr, which are able to replicate any damage dealt to them, including critical damage and status damage. Tornadoes will be able to store the status damage dealt to them and apply this over time, which is able to trigger arcanes like Arcane Impetus. But tornadoes can only hold and deal one type of elemental damage at any given moment. This is based on the total status damage dealt to the tornado, influenced by your highest weighted elemental type on the weapon. Tornadoes will keep track of total elemental damage dealt to them, meaning you can first deal 100 corrosive damage to one, which will then proc corrosive, and afterwards you can shoot the same tornado for, let's say, 200 radiation damage, which then becomes the highest damage value. After which the tornado will switch its damage type to radiation. This damage type is chosen irrespective of the status chance values, which means low status chance weapons can still apply their elemental damage type to a tornado. The damage type switching results in the ability to apply different kinds of elemental damage types. But this is often limited by the number of total weapons you have equipped, as these will interchange their highest weighted element. This will remain the case even if you have exactly even distributions of elemental weightings, since in this case the chosen element will be applied based on alphabetical order. There are some sneaky ways to get more elements to proc by, for instance, using bullet jump mods on your Warframe, which you can then use to go through the tornadoes, and afterwards you can shoot the same tornado with another weapon to trigger a new status effect. You can also choose to use the Pseudo or Pseudo Prime, which can randomly shoot an entire array of elements. However, this is not that useful outside of providing a couple more stacks for Arcane Impetus. Tornadoes themselves count as something akin to objects. However, they are able to, as I just mentioned, carry over all damage dealt to them, which will then be distributed to enemies that are being held by the tornadoes, or if they are within a 10-meter range of the tornadoes. This 10-meter range will be unaffected by ability range mods. The pickup range of tornadoes, however, is affected by range mods. Or at least, that is what I thought. Editing Casey here, I did some more testing, and it seems that even the pickup range is not affected by any of the range mods, and determines the range in which enemies without overguard, and thus vulnerable to crowd control effects, will be pulled into a clustering vortex in the middle of the tornadoes. Because tornadoes count as objects, they are unable to be affected by any type of status effect, which also means that condition overload will never work on tornadoes when targeting them directly. If you want to use condition overload mechanics, make sure you aim for the actual enemies caught in the vortex to still benefit from the additional upfront damage. Shooting a single tornado will apply the damage you deal to all enemies trapped within the vortex. This makes weapons with punch through or weapons with radial damage that can hit multiple tornadoes at once powerful choices to consider on Zephyr. Furthermore, any critical damage you deal to enemies caught in the vortex, with replicated damage from tornadoes, will be subject to a final ×2 critical damage multiplier, so make sure to mod for those crit stats. When you shoot into a tornado, some weapons will use unexpected critical chance scaling. This occurs with weapons that have multiple fire modes and damage types. Here, tornadoes will always use the first set of crit stats to inherit, and these are then the ones that are used for tornado damage. There are too many of these examples to list them all, but you can easily spot them in the arsenal when looking at their stats. This crit inherit can sometimes be beneficial or detrimental depending on the type of weapon. For instance, on the Netteruk, it will be a huge crit loss as the first stat featured is that for the quick shot, while the perfect shot has way higher crit values. But in some cases it can also be a huge crit boost, for instance for the Bubonico, which has higher crit stats featured as the first stat line compared to the radial burst altfire. This brings me to the two types of tornadoes you can cast. First, they can be cast as wandering tornadoes by tapping the ability button. These will freely roam around and suck up enemies into them. However, this makes damage replication a little bit more tricky. These wandering tornadoes can be useful, however, especially when combined with something like a melee influence build together with blast damage, since it is able to spread the massive damage increase in a large radius, and tornadoes will do extra damage from enemies being hit by melee influence. Wandering tornadoes can also be guided towards places by holding the aim button, after which the closest tornado to your reticle will move towards the spot you are currently pointing at. The second way in which tornadoes can be cast is stationary, where tornadoes will always stay statically in one place, ensuring maximum damage replication. In general, I would advise casting stationary tornadoes for more control over your damage. As this is the hold cast of this ability, you could consider swapping the hold cast ability settings for Zephyr. But beware that both Tailwind, your first ability, and Airburst, your second ability, are in my opinion more useful as their basic tap cast. Before I actually go into when the moth starts to go bananas, I want to introduce the augment for Zephyr's tornadoes called Funnel Clouds. Funnel Clouds disables the ability to suck up enemies in the vicinity and instead spawns more tornadoes at 50% of their original size. While enemies are not actively sucked up into the vortex, you can still cause this to happen yourself by casting Zephyr's second ability Airburst, or by applying the lifted status effect from things like slam attacks. Because of this quality of life that Airburst can provide, I would suggest you never replace it with any Helminth for this exact reason. Instead, I would always Helminth off Tailwind unless I'm going for a target fixation build, which I will cover in my full in-depth Zephyr guide. Funnel Clouds will be able to spawn a new total of 11 tornadoes instead of the original 3, which can all replicate damage done to the enemies suspended above the tornadoes or within the 10 meter range. Again, using weapons with punch through or radial damage is advised. The math behind tornadoes becomes increasingly more difficult when we start to factor in the best damage combination for Zephyr, which is Zata's Whisper combined with blast damage. Blast and Zata's Whisper interact with each other in a way where a blast effect going off will also deal an extra instance of Zata Whisper damage. This then becomes increasingly powerful if multiple enemies are within a confined range of each other. Further scaling of the blast damage occurs when either 10 blast procs are reached on a target or when a target dies, scaling with the formula for blast damage as previously discussed in my Melee Doughty video. When we then introduce tornadoes into the mix, tornadoes will be able to replicate these blast damage instances, dealing damage to targets and also triggering a Zata Whisper damage instance. In total, you can end up with 7 damage instances, which are the initial damage from something like a radial attack, the Zata's Whisper proc from this initial damage, the tornado damage from this initial damage, then we have the Zata's Whisper proc from the tornado damage of the initial damage, and then besides this we also have the blast going off, so we have the blast of the initial damage, we have the tornado damage of the blast of the initial damage, and we have the Zata's Whisper proc of the tornado damage of the blast of the initial damage. I know how you're feeling right now, I was losing my mind as well. Anyways, all of these instances can be multiplied by the number of enemies within the hit radius of the blast and the number of tornadoes you have. Keep in mind that when you use funnel clouds, tornadoes spread in around a 10 meter circle, which automatically means that it is likely you will miss a few of these instances, as not every tornado will be hit by the blast damage instance. But I will disregard this fact for the theoretical damage calculations I will show in a bit. Other good elements for Zephyr to consider outside of using blast are gas and to some extent electric damage, although they are not as strong as they used to be and are definitely not as strong as blast post Jade Shadows. Gas and electric will not be able to trigger Zata's Whisper, meaning that in those cases, Roar will outperform as a Helminth option due to its double dipping in status damage. However, these two status effects will be able to hit tornadoes for additional tornado damage, and both will deal lingering damage for 6 seconds in a rather small 3 meter radius, meaning that they aren't half bad for tornado damage. Furthermore, by using a relatively buggy mechanism in the game called Gas Afflictions, which is where the melee arcane melee afflictions and gas damage have a weird infinitely scaling interaction, you can create damage clouds that deal millions of damage over a small period of time, which combined with tornadoes will instantly kill any enemy that enters this stinky radius. Heavy Slams and Zephyr are a combination which have already been extensively covered in the Warframe creator ecosphere, which I will link sources of in the description. And I have extensively featured this combination in my own videos as well. Slam attacks are particularly good for Zephyr due to their damage scaling with Seismic Slam and the Nera mod set, as well as the combo multiplier, which all stack together to create ridiculous damage amplifications. Slam attacks are able to deal a large amount of damage in a relatively large area, scaling up to 20 meters for some particular weapons like the Ruvox, the Praedos, the Magistar Incarnon, and the Arcatitron. Editing Casey here, I forgot to mention the Sampotes and Tenet Exec for slamming, which will generate multiple fields of slam attack damage that can hit all of the tornadoes multiple times. Do note that as far as I know, the Sampotes is still bugged and will actually not apply the combo multiplier to the slam fields that it spawns. However, if this does get fixed, I will update the pinned comment that you can find below the video. However, these slam attacks will have fall-off damage, meaning that the damage towards the outer edges of this 20-meter area is diminished by a certain percentage as stated in the arsenal. This can also be nicely illustrated when slamming into tornadoes, showing tornadoes towards the outer edges to take less damage. Now, for my ridiculous damage example, I will use the Arcatitron, as this has a unique slam capacitor effect that further scales slam damage. I calculated the initial fully modded slam damage to be around 137 million in the best case scenario, taking into consideration maximum slam capacitor stacks. Then, using damage formulas exemplified by Dystopia, I was able to calculate that in a perfect scenario, estimated theoretical damage can skyrocket up to an absurd 63 trillion damage. To put this number into perspective, over the course of 2024, the entire Warframe player base killed a total of around 300 billion enemies. If we were to keep up this pace, it would only take us a mere 210 years to get to 63 trillion. And if you thought this was the highest damage that Zephyr could do, boy oh boy, are you wrong. Enter Recursive Damage, also known as looping damage. Looping damage is something that is quite rare in Warframe, as it often results in scenarios where the game completely grinds to a halt. A good example of this was Contagious Bond upon its release, which at that time did not feature a cap for the number of status procs it would carry forward, which in hindsight might have caused some domestic fires on old PC hardware. Nevertheless, some of these damage loops remain in the game. One example of this is recursive damage via Zephyr's tornadoes, which can be triggered in a couple of ways. First, we have a limited number of special mods that are able to deal a percentage of enemy health as damage, scaling with enemy level indefinitely, in a specified radius whenever an enemy dies. And the funny thing about tornadoes is that they will actually function like a carbon copy of your own weapon, meaning that they will also inherit the on-kill effect of these types of mods. This will then be the way in which the damage loop is able to be started. If a blast is initiated by an enemy, the damage of this blast will be reflected by the tornadoes, which are then able to trigger a new blast, starting the chain again. This principle was also featured in one of Dystopia's videos, where he used the Sobek with acid shells to create a spectacle of damage numbers. Each damage loop in this way will trigger another 7 damage instances per enemy killed, and the total damage instances are then increased for each tornado hit. While all of these on-kill effects can be used to varying degrees, 2 of them stick out from the others, those being acid shells and Vulcan Blitz. Acid shells is great because the on-kill effect covers a massive 15-meter radius, which is most likely to cover all of the stationary funnel cloud tornadoes. And it has a middle of the pack enemy health damage scaling at 45%. This 45% enemy HP damage can then be increased by using the Vigilante mod set to force critical hits. You can also consider using Roar to increase this damage, however then you will lose some of the damage instances, which could be triggered by using Zata's Whisper. The only downside of the Sobek with acid shells is that getting the first kill to start the damage loop, especially at higher levels, can get a bit tricky. Because of this, another good consideration for damage looping is the Vulcan Blitz mod for the Jet-Attack hammer weapon. The Vulcan Blitz mod features a smaller 6 damage radius, but scales with 60% of the enemy's HP. This 60% can then again be scaled by faction damage mods, just like with acid shells, but it can also be increased by the stealth damage multiplier, which you can get if you are invisible. For Zephyr, this means you will rely on either an Ashe in your squad with the augment for Smokescreen, a Wukong with the augment for Cloudwalker, or an Octavia with Metronome. Vulcan Blitz, in comparison to acid shells, will have less issues to trigger, as you can rely on heavy slams to kill the first enemy target, which is not that hard to do with Zephyr and is thus a good alternative. But, like I said, mods like Thermagnetic Shells for the Detron can also wreak havoc upon low to medium level enemies, and even the Saxon mod set can be used to nuke very early on in the game. For the calculation example in this part of the video, I chose acid shells with the recursion taken into consideration. The perfect scenario would net you with a mind-boggling theoretical damage estimate of 90 trillion, which, if we use the same example as before with the total enemies killed in Warframe per year, will take the entire Warframe player base another 300 years to reach. Delving into the on-kill effects, I wondered whether other on-kill effects from, for instance, Incarnon weapons would also be triggered by tornadoes. And lo and behold, they indeed do. This means that both the on-kill effect from the dual Ichor Incarnon and the Okina Incarnon can be spread and also be looped by Zephyr's tornadoes. I illustrated this in 2 separate shorts uploaded on the channel, but I will give some more context here. Because the tornado behaves as a replica of your weapon the moment you deal damage to it, Incarnon on-kill effects can be triggered by kills made via reflected tornado damage. This means that you can begin looping the toxic sludge pools of the dual Ichor Incarnon with the help of tornadoes. And in this specific case, I would suggest you use wandering tornadoes for maximum toxic waste spreading and environmental pollution. This tactic can continuously wipe enemies an entire room away from you if the tornado was primed with the on-kill effect, especially at lower level content. In the case of the Okina Incarnon, it gets even crazier, as each new dagger is able to instantly fly to an enemy once it's generated, if said enemy is within range. In case you are close to one or several tornadoes, the tornado will immediately absorb and reflect the damage and status effects of this dagger and deal it to the enemies within its radius. Each tornado that helped kill this target is able to summon a dagger, so when multiple tornadoes contribute to killing one enemy, it is likely that you can get multiple daggers generated per enemy. Again, here, slam attacks will be your best friend as they hit multiple tornadoes at once, making sure all tornadoes contribute. Alternatively, you can combine this with melee influence, which is able to duplicate initial damage instances upon status procs, which the daggers will have a guaranteed one of, which is the cold damage. And if you start aligning these puzzle pieces, you can see another crazy damage loop begin to occur. This is why the Okina Incarnon, with melee influence, is an absolute beast on Zephyr, even without slamming. This then brings me to another type of weapons, which are the kill charging weapons. These kill charging weapons have a mechanic whereby an alternate fire mode gets charged whenever a kill is made. Examples of this are the Trumna and the Batacore, but even archguns like the Mausolon have this feature. Often the problem with these weapons is that it is a bit cumbersome to get the kills to start charging the cool and often way more powerful alt fire. However, Zephyr can help with this, as tornadoes can hit and kill multiple enemies easily, and all kills made via the tornadoes will count as kills towards this alternate fire mode. In the past, even the alternate fire modes themselves would count as kills towards the alternate fire mode, resulting in you never even having to use the primary fire. However, this got patched, in most cases. The exception that remains and is able to charge its own alt fire is the Trumna. Instead of the alt fire immediately counting as primary fire mode kills, the alt fire of the Trumna has to bounce at least once for the game not considering the projectiles to come from the Trumna anymore. And in this case, they will again be able to contribute to the charging mechanic. An easy way to trigger this is by finding a tall room with a ceiling or a long corridor in which you can shoot either the alt fire against the ceiling or the wall, after which the bounce projectiles will again charge your alt fire. In general, weapons that have this kill charge effect feel a lot better to use and a lot more fun to use on Zephyr because of the help they get from her tornadoes. And last but not least, some of the best weapon types for Zephyr are the AoE radial damage weapons, which includes weapons like the Kuva Brahma and the Kuva Tsar. But this even extends to weapons like the Proboscis Cernos and the Quanta Vandal, or secondary weapons like the Icarius Prime. All of these weapons are characterized by their ability to deal damage in a large radius, which, as you now understand, is ideal for replicated tornado damage. Blast radii of primary AoE weapons can easily be increased with Firestorm or Primed Firestorm, and on secondaries you can use Primed Fulmination. This will ensure maximum tornado coverage and thus maximum damage. As I illustrated before, these weapons will be best used with the Blast Damage and Zata's Whisper combo. Other types of AoE weapons which are incredibly powerful are the weapons with lingering AoE effects, like the Turret in its non-Incarnal mode and the Pox or its newer version, the Coda Pox. If you mod for blast damage, these fields will continuously proc blast status effects, which get spread amongst the tornadoes and the enemies within the vortex. Weapons that also have these lingering kind of effects are more obscure weapons like the Azima and the Zenistar. which are also great to use with tornadoes. Even AoE options, which you may have forgotten, like concealed explosives for throwing stars like the Hiku, can be incredibly powerful if modded for faction damage, multi-shot and fire rate. The sheer amount of damage instances resulting from this easily halves my game's performance on what I would say is a pretty decent PC setup. Other weapons with AoE effects like glaives are also incredible on Zephyr, since they have high damage in a pretty decent radius. Especially the heavy attack of the Halakar Wraith with melee influence is able to obliterate any level of enemy captured in the vortex. But tornadoes do not only scale well with weapons. There are also some abilities that have interesting interactions with tornadoes. The point I've now hopefully proven is that Zata's Whisper is by far the best Helminth when you combine it with Zephyr's tornadoes. However, some other Helminth options that have interesting interactions with tornadoes remain. So let's see what these abilities are and why they can be pretty nifty. The first one I want to mention is Vauban's Tesla Nervos, but only with the augment mod Tesla Bank. This augment enables enemies stuck with the Nervo to store damage dealt to them, which is then released upon death in a radius scaled by modding for ability range. This Helminth is nice to pair with lower level gear if you are just starting a game, as you will only have to whittle down the health of the stuck enemy for it to begin nuking all of the other enemies captured in the vortex. However, compared to the earlier explained recursive damage, this loop will be contained to a total of 4, since you can only summon 4 Nervos at one given moment. The second ability I found to work quite well for synergizing with tornadoes is Tempest Barrage from Hydroid, including its augment Viral Tempest. This ability will rain down a whole bunch of projectiles that deal radial damage to the tornadoes, which will of course be replicated by them. With the Viral Tempest augment, you immediately apply a bunch of viral stacks to the enemies as well, increasing your damage another 4.25 times. This ability can be cast multiple times in a single area to create, as the name of the ability would suggest, a full-blown barrage of damage raining down on enemies. This can be used up into Steel Path, but will perform more efficiently in lower level content. This then brings me to a topic slightly outside of the tornadoes of Zephyr, which is the band-aid solution that DE has provided to us Warframe nerds being able to hit integer limit damage on the regular, which is called damage attenuation. Damage attenuation and damage attenuation bypass mechanics are a topic which I have discussed in a previous video where I explain how to one-shot Archon bosses. In short, damage attenuation is a formula which DE implemented to reduce the amount of damage you are able to deal by artificially reducing this damage to a predetermined maximum, which is reached over a certain amount of time, or in case of Warframe, the actual rendered frames by your system. Damage attenuation bypass can be performed in the legal and not so legal way. In the legal way, you can use techniques as discussed in my guide, where you optimize for the amount of damage instances, something which you now know Zephyr's Tornadoes with Blast Damage and Zata's Whisper to excel at. We do this because the relatively low damage cap, for most bosses around 175k, can only be increased by creating more of these 175k maxed out instances. Some mini-bosses like Acolytes feature other forms of damage attenuation, but that is outside of the scope of this video. Now, in the not so legal way, you would be able to use, for instance, some sketchy software to tank the performance of your game so that the damage attenuation takes longer to kick in, as you will have less frames rendered. If this is done by the host of the match, while the other players have normal performance, there is a longer artificial window in which high amounts of damage can be dealt, while the damage attenuation reaches its damage cap. This not so legal and definitely not recommended approach was used by a variety of players during the Gargoyle's Cry event to massively speed up the boss fight. However, in general, I would just suggest you sticking to Zephyr to avoid having your account banned until 2035. Hi, Editing Casey here once again all the way at the end, where I want to mention something which is very important, and this is that damage attenuating bypass via Zephyr's Tornadoes has been nerfed as of Techworld Encore. This happened after I had initially recorded the script and started working on this video. However, there have been 0 patch notes stating that this change was either unintentional or intentional. It has been completely swept under the rug, which is a bit odd for DE as they usually have quite clear and open communication. Anyhow, it looks like the fix was on the side of the enemies and not on the side of Zephyr and Tornadoes, as they will still insta-kill anything that doesn't attenuate damage. However, this change means that damage attenuating units, such as Babao, won't be one-shot anymore, and other bosses like Archons and the Fragmented one also fall under this category. Either way, I decided to leave this part of the script in the video as it still had some interesting information which you might have found helpful. Just take into consideration that damage attenuating bypass in the legal way has now been fixed. This then finally brings me to the recap of the Tornado ability in 1 minute. Tornado is arguably Warframe's strongest ability. Tornadoes are able to replicate damage numbers, including critical damage and status damage, and can in some cases create damage looping effects that test the game's code and your shitty 2015 Lenovo ThinkPad's flammability. Because of the absolute spaghetti mess of a code that probably hides behind this ability, it is likely going to remain one of the most consistently broken abilities that will continue to cause DE some headaches. Combining Zephyr with radial damage, blast damage and Zata's Whisper can result in builds that can easily push level cap and have a decent amount of kills per minute without much effort. Of course, Zephyr's tornadoes have endless damage combinations with other Warframes. However, for this video I had no time to test all of these different permutations, and if you have some ideas for synergies yourself, make sure to leave them in the comments close to those like and subscribe buttons, and I might investigate them in the future. Until then, and many thanks for watching this one. Bye. Because the tornado behaves as a replica of your Whammon. Whammon? What the f? Whammon. Respect Whammon. As always, thanks to all channel members for supporting the channel. If you are looking to become a member, please find the join button below the video.